الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد بن عبد الله أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to yet another one of our Usul talks, inshallah. Today we'll be covering a very important topic on the future of the university, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, with a very dear guest and friend of mine. Most of you know who I am, so I won't be introducing myself, other than to say that I'm Academic Director of Usul Academy. With me is an esteemed guest and an old friend, Dr. Mujaddad Zaman, who's a research and teaching fellow at the Center of Islamic Theology at the University of Tübingen, and also a project manager at Ilm Project, which is also a wonderful Islamic education project run also in Germany. One of the Dr. Mujaddad Zaman's specializations, his PhD from the University of Cambridge, was in education, which is where I met him many years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago. But it's also where we kind of developed a mutual understanding about both the benefits of modern day university, but it's also very severe limitations. And so each one of us in our own way went about navigating how to supplement or complement our modern day university experience by seeking sacred knowledge with teachers, traditional teachers, and through the path of Islamic institutions or Islamic circles, alhamdulillah. So today we decided to come together. We've been having this conversation for a while, and I thought, what better way than to actually have an open conversation in front of all of you about our thoughts, our musings over the past few years about the university and where we see the role of classical or indigenous Islamic learning can fit in. Can I just ask everyone, please, to mute your audio so that there's no disruption to the Shamsuddin? Can you just mute your audio, please? There's a bit of background noise.
Yeah, okay.
Barakallahu feekum.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for that. So the future of the university, what future does it hold for us? And what are its limitations? And what role can traditional Islamic educational institutions, or the traditional knowledge enterprise, as I like to call it, play a role in all of this? I'm going to start with a bit of a few reflections and musings on the nature of Islamic knowledge and its pursuit, inshallah. And then after that, I want to start engaging my colleague Mujaddid with a few questions, and then there's going to be kind of a back and forth, inshallah, conversation over this. I think one of the most important things to learn and understand while we enter into this discussion, or any discussion for that matter, when we talk about any topic today, we really have to delve into or internalize what the traditional Islamic principle is about this, and approach it from that point of view. So this seal, this grounding of our perspectives and our understandings in a classical Islamic way is really important. And if we pose the question, what is the objective of the knowledge enterprise in Islam? Why is it, or what was the objective of all these great institutions of learning? And of course, in the classical Islamic tradition, there were the Darsi Nizami, there was the madrasa system that was quite pervasive across the Islamic world, from Morocco to China, and from Central Asia all the way to Sub-Saharan Africa. But it wasn't just the madrasa that was the only institution of learning. There were a wide range of institutions that formed a kind of a network of relations, but also a network of hierarchical relations, if you want to call it that, and all together constituted the knowledge enterprise of Islam. And they all taught a curricula which was rooted in the fundamental idea of the unity of knowledge, or a tawhidic approach to the nature of knowledge, reality being one, reality being manifestation of divine names, God's creation. Everything in creation therefore pointed to the one, And so there was this really fundamental, strong emphasis on the idea that knowledge was one or unified, which isn't to say
Guck mal, ob
that
das zu ist.
there was.
Ich mache schon laut. Nicht selber. Guck mal, ob das zu ist, das Video. Ich habe Angst.
Sorry, can you please, whoever's talking in the background, just mute yourself, please, so we can not be distracted, inshallah. The focus was on the unity of knowledge, and the unity of knowledge was grounded in the unity of reality. But simultaneously, there was a deep and profound recognition, given the diversity of divine names and the diversity of reality, there's also a diversity of forms of knowledge. But the diversity of forms of knowledge did not lead to a fragmentation of knowledge. And it's what we tend to see today prevalent in the modern day university. There's a wonderful quote in a book by Sayyid Hussein Nasr called Science and Civilization in Islam, where he says, one might say that the aim of all the Islamic sciences, and more generally speaking, of all the medieval and ancient cosmological sciences, is to show the unity and interrelatedness of all that exists. Which means here there is a recognition that reality is diverse, but underlying this diversity, there is a fundamental unity. And so the pursuit of knowledge is to understand, or the pursuit of these various Islamic sciences is to understand how this unity is manifest in this diversity, or how this diversity is interrelated. So it is to show the unity and interrelatedness of all that exists, so that in contemplating the unity of the cosmos, the human being may be led to the unity of the divine principle. That is the objective of knowledge. Human beings may be led to the unity of the divine principle, of which the unity of nature is the image. And so this fundamental underlying unity of reality means that all knowledge ultimately leads to one, but it also a simultaneous recognition of the multiplicity of forms of knowledge. Now, if multiplicity exists, or if multiple forms of knowledge exist, then the second aspect of a Tawhidic epistemology, or this understanding of unity of knowledge, is that we try to see how the classical Islamic tradition understood how these various forms of knowledge are related to one another. And this is where you get this fundamental science of Tartib al-Ulum, or Ihsa al-Ulum, or Taqsim al-Ulum. And that is a way of hierarchically relating the various forms of knowledge to one another based on the object of study or knowledge. Of course, and all of this is unified in what? All this type of knowledge is possible in Insan al-Kamil. So, and this is a very important point, because ultimately when we think of the university today, we ask ourselves, what's the point of university education? It's quite difficult to come up with a coherent answer. You get all sorts of different responses. But at least in the classical Islamic understanding, the highest and most noble objective of the knowledge enterprise is the tahqiq, or the realization of al-insan al-kamil. And this is done through the process of what we might call education or tarbiyah, that includes ta'aleem and ta'deeb and tazkiyah. And there are a wider range of other terms, but suffice it to say, it requires moral and ethical training, intellectual training, and spiritual training. And once these are achieved, this holistic educational system is achieved that addresses all aspects of the human being. The perfect human being, al-insan al-kamil, is realized. And then once the insan al-kamil is realized, then the possibility of this unified knowledge, or this knowledge that unifies the fragmentary perspectives of reality into an overarching one, pointing to the divine reality, becomes a reality. That's the ultimate objective. That doesn't exclude the possibilities of other objectives of knowledge. But once we lose sight of this fundamental objective, all things begin to fall apart. And so coming back to this idea that reality is one yet diverse, and knowledge is one but yet diverse, we get this idea, a very important understanding of reality as consisting of multiple levels. At Usul Academy, we deploy, or we use a term used by Dr. Rajab Shantuk, the idea of multiplexity, the idea that reality is complex, multiple, and there's a hierarchical relationship between different levels of reality. In the classical Islamic tradition, we often refer to them as Alam al-Lahur and Alam al-Malakut, Alam al-Mulk. These are different levels of reality, and each one is subdivided into other categories or other levels of reality. But then, more importantly, corresponding to these different levels of reality, there are corresponding forms of knowledge. The human being also, of course, is a multiplex creature consisting of a body, consisting of a soul or a nafs, and consisting of a ruh or a spirit. And different aspects of the human being, the body, the soul, the spirit, requires a different form of knowledge. The same way that different aspects or different levels of reality require different forms of knowledge. And of course, in the Islamic tradition, the sources of knowledge are multiple. We can divide them broadly into two broad categories, if you will. And this is something we teach in a well-known text of ours, Theories and Methods at Usul. The first is there are objective sources of knowledge, meaning sources of knowledge that are external to the individual or are subject to objective criteria of knowledge that are external to the individual. There's al-naqliyat or revelation, al-khabar al-sadiq. There's al-aqliyat or practical sciences or the reason, aql. And then there is al-hissiyat or sense perception. So these are the three broad sources of knowledge that we might call objective. But then there's also other sources of knowledge that we might call subjective. They're based or rooted in the individual experience of the person, of an individual. And these have to do with hads, intuition, dreams, ru'ya, ilham, inspiration, or unveiling and kashf. So you can see here automatically, and each one of these, of course, forms of knowledge had its own methodology. So here we have already a very complex branching of knowledge, all interconnected to one another. None of these forms of knowledge are mutually exclusive, but they complement each other. Right? The empirical knowledge does not contradict or is not mutually exclusive with rational knowledge, nor is rational knowledge conflict with reported knowledge or revealed knowledge, nor does that conflict necessarily with spiritual knowledge, kashfiyat. And so, as part of this knowledge enterprise in Islam, we get by the 12th, 13th, 14th century, all the way up to the late Ottoman and Mughal period, we get this wonderful synthesis, a wonderful, great epistemological edifice where different forms of knowledge lead to different methods lead to different forms of knowledge, and different forms of knowledge lead to different aspects of reality. But those are not mutually exclusive with others. They're all part of a greater synthesis, a greater harmonic relationship between the various forms of knowledge based on the harmonic unity of reality itself. And this is attested to in a lot of writings. One can adduce quotes from Tashkubuzada or from Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani and many others about how there's a mutual complementarity between the deductive inference or rational thinking and ways of dhawq and witnessing and unveiling, etc., etc. This great synthesis or this great epistemological edifice became the backbone of the knowledge enterprise and underpin the great institutions of learning that pervaded the Islamic world at the time, until the time in which of course, modern knowledge enterprises on the back of colonialism made their way into the Islamic world. And many of these traditional institutions of learning, for all sorts of reasons, which we don't get into right now, were crumbled or were deliberately undermined and destroyed, and quickly replaced with the modern day universities. Now, while the Islamic world experimented with these new forms of knowledge and these new institutions, one can't really argue in favor of the fact that it has led us to where we hoped it would lead us to, at least not for those who introduced these institutions quite happily and participated in the destruction of the traditional forms of knowledge and their institutions. I'm going to stop there, and I want to ask my colleague, Dr. Zaman, about how was it that, what would you say is the narrative or history or the story of a modern day university, and why did it become so appealing to Muslims in the early 20th century. How did we get here is I suppose the question.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى والسلام على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everybody, and thank you ever so much Dr. Samir for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today. The kind of tail end of the weekend. I appreciate people coming together to talk about, I think, what is a very important and propitious moment in the institution of the university, which in one way or another affects us all. In terms of your question, Dr. Smith, it's a really fascinating one. I think it's something we'll have to flesh out together. In terms of how we got here, I think what's important initially to consider is how successful the narrative or the long history of the university has been. I think perhaps of many of the medieval pre-modern institutions which have been lost in the modern period, the university kind of stands forth and can be proud of the fact that it has a history, at least in the Western tradition, of 16 centuries, which itself is an incredible feat. Other institutions such as the charitable poor houses, if you think about the guild systems, they've all become relics of a distant past. The university, Universitas Magisterium, the kind of collective body of scholars and students together in the knowledge enterprise, as you so eloquently put, Dr. Samir, remains in one shape or another. And the problems that inheres is something I think we'll get to. But in terms of the history, I think it's important because the history impacts the present, and in absolute terms, if you think about the success of the modern university, it has become in the 21st century tantamount to individual success. University degrees and the accruement of credentials are essential for things like economic flourishment, for individual satisfaction and ideas of identity. That's how important university degrees have become for some reason. If you look at admission rates in the UK, in America, North America, of those of eligible age, almost 40% of the eligible age for undergraduates between 18 and 23, 24 will enter some form of higher education that requires a university setting. That's an incredible amount, just considering a century ago in Edwardian England. The eligible population going to universities was less than 2%, around 1.8, 1.6% or so. So that's an incredible inflation that's happened. And it's history and where we are today with this kind of very big juggernaut that we call the modern university. It's like it doesn't have a primrose path to success or failure. It's a very interesting long story, and so kind of truncating it for our purposes today, we have to essentially go back to religious story, the religious story of the monastic reforms of the 6th century or so. People like Cassiodorus, and in the Western Latin tradition, who were Benedictine monks reconfiguring scriptural education, standardizing it. This is the period also where we get in the 6th century from the Trivium and Quadrivium. Cassiodorus, the kind of monk and great statesman, someone who popularized these ideas. Just the generation before with Boethius, it's where we actually, the philosophers, where we get the term Trivium and Quadrivium and the kind of standard model for what would become medieval education. Along with that, you have the Clunic reforms of the monasteries and the monastic schools, which essentially will become configured into the universities in the 10th, 11th centuries. But they come out of the medieval period at a very interesting time. This is a time when you have the Great Migration period in Europe, where the decline of the Western Europe, Roman Empire essentially creates a lot of migration, certainly in the southern basin of the Mediterranean, as well as in Western Europe. and there is a lot of movement, and you can see that kind of patterning in the student bodies of the early universities in Bologna, Salamanca, Oxford, and Cambridge, and certainly in Paris. So it's born out of a really fascinating tension between political movements which are happening outside, religious needs in the community. Most of the early universities, as I mentioned, in the late 11th century, early 12th century, are giving students who enroll the licentia diocesi, which is a teaching certificate, and even doctorate, docere, which is derived from the Latin meaning to teach. These are important developments because the idea is that teaching and the progression of tradition, thinking about and studying nature and scriptural sources, has to be standardized in some way. And this is really a fascinating comparison with the traditional madrasa system, which doesn't have that kind of centralization in its bearings, in its architecture. So a lot of the early universities are decreed by papacy bull. It has to be ratified rather by Rome in order for it to be officially teaching doctrine. And so that's the kind of the early interesting place of the university, is a place of introspection. It's a place of moral development to an extent. A lot of these universities, as I mentioned, came out of Benedictine tradition and the later Franciscan traditions as well. And so it has a very strong, fervent, religious, spiritual element. And if you look at the kind of ordainees from Merton College at Oxford, for example, the first college at Oxford University, it reads like a medieval guild, with the emphasis on individual spiritual development of students. So that's always was definitely part of it. The thing that really, I think, propels the university in this era is its interaction with the Islamic world, specifically in the kind of the rebirth of classical antiquity and the commentaries that are pouring into Western Europe. That's a very important element of it, because kind of the interaction with Islam gives life and color to the universe, as it were. And you can not perhaps fathom the works of Salem and Aquinas and Lombard and others without the kind of very strong intellectual motor force of Islam and the works that kind of find their way into that system. So in any case, the university at this period is what we assume and what we kind of have this kind of picturesque idea of what it means to be a university, but it's also suffering from a lot of internal problems. The universities kind of stood as little mini states, as it were, certainly in Paris and then later in Oxford and Bologna, because they kind of operate under their own laws and such. That's important because there is, within even this period, we find a lot of internal discussions about what really is the purpose of this learning and how does it relate to our lives. We have famously the Kamena Burana, which is a litany of university songs which were found not so long ago. And Walter Off makes a famous compositional contribution in that way in the 20th century, setting these songs to music. But there you find really fascinating discussions. You have someone like Walter Chatelain, who writes Quodant ateris nisi loctum et laborium, which means what is the purpose of learning these arts apart from misery and toil? So there's a really fascinating early discussion about these, the purposes of these sciences and why are they learning them. And that kind of continues on later through the Renaissance with someone like Petrus Ramos, the great Protestant reformer of the modern university. And if you look at the way that faculties are set up today, much of it can be traced back to Ramos's reconfiguration of the university, basically kicking out the traditional Aristotelian curriculum, which is a very important part of the classical world. And so the story kind of continues and develops. And in Europe, especially, what's important is that in this early modern period, from the 1700s onwards, is that in continental Europe, you have a great number of universities being set up, and much of them are related to political conflict. I would recommend looking at a piece of work by Phyllis Riddle, who in the early 90s showed how where there's greater political conflict, greater number of universities were set up, especially in Western Europe. So that kind of long story continues, and it kind of ends up with the 20th century with people like Clark Kerr, the first rector, the chancellor of Berkeley University, giving a real honest reflection of what the university means and stands for. And he says, actually, we cannot call it a university anymore. It's not a university, it's a multiversity, meaning that we have placed all of these disparate intellectual, social, spiritual mechanisms and pursuits into a place that can no longer really hold them. And that's where we begin to really see the cracks forming, especially after in the later in the 1968 and the kind of student riots, how the public intellectual and the rise of the social sciences, especially in France, you have President Pompidou and the development of a great number of universities that come out of the latter 1960s, early 70s, which kind of create the format of the modern university. So when we think about problems and the failures of the modern university, there are a great many. There are very few institutions that have such a derisive and critical eye upon them than the modern university. And so if you were to think about the failures, and perhaps I can end with this, is there is a problem of place, the problem of where does the university stand in terms of the economy, the state. Traditionally, it's been marked by a historical distance from state power and certainly the economy. It's education for its own sake. And so that has made strange bedfellows of the modern university, meaning ultimately questions of life and its purpose, knowledge and its unity, and goodness and its reference to beauty. How does the beautiful life envelop through learning? And ultimately, these are failures of the imagination, perhaps. So we have a fascinating institution which we don't really know what its future holds, but I guess that's why we're here speaking today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Mujaddad. That's the kind of trajectory from the medieval all the way to the modern, postmodern university. I suppose today we're no longer in the age of the modern university. We're really in the age of a postmodern university, and which is an age in which we go to university, we study whatever course we want to study. There's no necessary unity to the knowledge we're studying. It's no longer pointing in any specific direction. It's highly fragmented, disconnected fields of knowledge with no unifying principle, and there's no sense in which there's even a hierarchy or hierarchical relationship between them. Because by flattening out perhaps reality into a single domain, single level, let's say the physical material domain, then no pursuit of any discipline is superlative over any other, because they're both exploring a flattened one-dimensional reality. And that comes at the expense of course, at least for us as Muslims, truth. I remember a conversation many years ago. Alistair McIntyre visited Oxford, and he gave a seminar there. And in a closed conversation with some Muslim brothers, he said he no longer has any faith in modern day university in producing real knowledge. In fact, he only praised a handful of seminaries in North America. They seem to be still producing knowledge that he considers to be of value in the sense of course, McIntyre belongs to that kind of Aristotelian tradition where knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of theoria, the contemplation of realities, leads to a kind of a fusion of subject-object and a realization of the reality of things beyond the mere sensible appearance. The kind of education of the soul, the acquisition of virtue, and the production of ever higher truths or haqa'iq, or arrival at these higher haqa'iq, will lead ultimately to divine reality, is no longer something that we can expect from a modern day university. And so this is where I think the role of the revival of indigenous Muslim institutions. I mean, there's no real objective reason why traditional Islamic institutions of learning should have become obsolete. There's a number of reasons why they were made to be obsolete, through physical colonization, but also colonization of minds and hearts of Muslims, rendering these kind of traditional institutions increasingly irrelevant in the lives of Muslims and enforcing this kind of hegemonic Western modern day university. But it seems that in the face of the almost impossible task of reforming the modern day university, this is where we see the importance of reviving sacred knowledge and traditional forms of learning. And here is where my question to you is, how do you think, or what role can traditional forms of knowledge or institutions of knowledge play in this modern context? Because it doesn't seem that we can kind of avoid the modern day university entirely just yet. Perhaps we haven't produced those powerful, influential, alternative Muslim institutions. But in the absence of that, what role can sacred knowledge play in this context?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I think the initial answer to that is we have a whole kind of civilizational discourse which can be animated at any point. And I think the modern university is a really interesting kind of, at a very interesting moment to hear what is happening. So I think here in North America, I'm sitting in America presently, you mentioned Christian colleges, and colleges such as Hillsdale and Belmont and others around here are basically doing their own thing, essentially. Notre Dame, of course, to a different extent. And they are asking fascinating questions of the modern world, trying to engage the kind of traditional, their own Torah in relationship to modern scholarship. But if you kind of really listen to what the students are needing and wanting, it is more than what modern university is able to supply, which is, how do I leave university with more than just the skills to pass an exam and the kind of technocratic nature of learning? What can I really learn about myself through this process? And then traditional ulum, those things are not separate. The idea that we are in an institution of learning requires us to think about education in its whole manner, and that idea of ihsan, that kind of perfected beauty of learning, doesn't mean that there is a distinction between means and ends, that everything is a means towards beauty and excellence. And so I think more than perhaps any other time than any time in its recent past, the modern university and the need for sacred knowledge, because if you look at what people are writing, if you look at the kind of things that are coming out of discussions at the highest levels of modern universities, they are inclining and leading towards very similar questions being asked by sacred-based academies, religious institutions, namely, how do we make sense of the world in a more unitive, in a more
Holistic, maybe.
yeah, in a more holistic environment where the sensibilities are placed together. How do we help fulfill the individual soul of students? How do we think about what is the soul? What is the purpose of learning? And so those are questions which the university is asking, but it doesn't really have ready-made answers to that because it's so fragmented, because it's a multiversity. I mean, it's interesting. Clark Kerr, the first chancellor of Berkeley, he said, he was asked in an interview when he became chancellor, what will be your mandate? And he said, well, a chancellor these days basically has three things to do. He has to provide sports for the alumni, parking for the administration, and sex for the undergraduates. And he said that without derision or in a risible manner. It's basically kind of tells you something about what the purpose of modern learning is. And essentially, when we talk about this decline of imagination in the modern university, we're talking about an institution that can no longer readily impact the lives of the students. So in any case, that's kind of a way to think about that the need for sacred knowledge is something higher than what's presently being taught.
It seems to me that recovering a more expansive Islamic horizon of knowledge allows one to then ask questions. If I have a aql, where do I pursue the training and education of aql? If I have senses, how do I train those? If I have a sense of imagination, or if I have a heart, how do I educate that aspect? And it seems that the modern education system and the modern university does not address any or most of these. I mean, one of the last bastions of our one of the last faculties that the university seems to have deliberately wanted to train is our reasoning faculty. But even that now has come under attack and assault with the complete, utter destruction of the very notion of reason and the very notion of the fact that reason can somehow penetrate into the very essential, intelligible nature of reality, with this whole nominalism and realism debate that's and the whole questioning of human nature, and the accusation of essentialism, and the idea that everything is somehow socially constructed, or that all knowledge is somehow a function of power. And this is where I think really the reviving now these kind of classical Islamic categories of understanding, ontology, epistemology, can really help. Now, in my mind, practically speaking, and I want us to go back to the day that you and I were students, and many of the attendees here are currently students at modern day universities. And so until we get to the point in the future where we can build the contemporary Islamic university that addresses knowledge in a holistic, unitary manner and help heal the world, in this fragmentary world that we're living in, where we're all enrolled in the modern day degrees, I see the model of, for example, what we have here at Usul as an interesting experiment, where we're saying, look, you students are at universities because you need to get those degrees, because you need to establish yourself in the world, you need to somehow get jobs. And some of the knowledge you're learning, or let's say the knowledge you're learning is valid at a certain level, right? It's not entirely false. It's just relative. It's a relative truth. And once you understand where it fits into the grand scheme of things, you can make a lot more sense of it. And so here we want to come along and say, look, you need to complement or supplement your one-dimensional, narrow training or education with a more expansive, richer ontological, epistemological framework to help you better understand the relative nature of what you're pursuing and studying and how it fits into a grander scheme of things, so that we can equip you with the tools so that you can then help maybe perhaps transform your field and expand it and make it roomier, as it were, or more expansive, and help push and develop the disciplines in your field in directions that perhaps are not currently possible at the modern day university. And I kind of feel like there's an urgent need and task for institutions like that. Can you kind of maybe, if you could highlight one or two areas where you think that perhaps an institution like Usul or others can really help focus or help equip a modern day student with university? What would you speak to that kind of need?
Yeah, I think you've kind of spelled it out really well, Dr. Samir. The idea of it being additive to whatever degree program you're involved in at a modern university. Because these ideas of the kind of fulfillment of learning, its holistic nature, the importance of a hierarchy and the connectivity of knowledge as well as of yourself, because often we forget that modern university doesn't treat you, the individual student, as a whole, or a staff member as a whole being, because it's not modernly programmed to do that. It treats your intellect in a certain way. It treats your senses in a certain way. It has all of these elements to connect with, but in no manner is that received entirely. So I think the programs that you're doing and the work that the Usul Academy is doing, it really is at the kind of the cusp of a new horizon, essentially, because we're standing in a place where the modern Western liberal conception of the university is itself going through a tremendous pattern of problems related to imagination, related to its place in the world and all the rest of it. And the classical madrasa systems do not necessarily speak to the entirety of everybody's experience as Muslims, for example. So you need something in the middle. You need something that can converse the traditional Torah with the contemporary academic environment. I believe that places such as Usul can provide that environment. It can provide a way, a doorway through which tradition begins to make sense for the individual in terms of, like, in a real way. I mean, I remember I did a master's, and I was, heavily working on Marx, for example, and Bourdieu and Foucault, and so it's kind of modern theory, classical theory as well. And somebody gave me a piece of work from Ibn Sina on time to look at, and it could have been in Greek. It made no sense to me whatsoever, and I just thought, wow, in my younger day arrogance, that what were these people thinking, writing things like this? And I mean, it's only later that you realize that you're entering a world of classical learning, which has a tartib. It has a manner in which you can't just kind of pick up the book and just kind of make sense of things. There is a whole universe behind it. And so for me, that was my own personal journey into these ideas. But yes, I think there's a great need and a great demand, and not just at the university level. This goes to schooling. And I know this is something that you, Dr. Samir, have been very much involved in, is the vast majority of Muslim children don't go to madrasa. They go to schools, secular modern schools, but they want to be attached to their tradition. They want to understand what they're learning in schools corresponds somehow to the kind of wonder, beauty, and the kind of the higher forms of truth which are inherent in the Islamic tradition. So how do we do that? How do we do that with literature? How do we do that with science and such? And so that is really the kind of the challenge, I think, right now in the 21st century.
Absolutely, absolutely. And by this additive approach, just to highlight a point that you alluded to, but to re-emphasize it, by bringing students from mainstream universities and introducing them to these sacred forms of knowledge, and expanding that kind of horizon of epistemology and ontology, we're not allowing that secular paradigm to dilute our sacred teachings, but rather our sacred teachings, they can transform that kind of secular knowledge and approach that students are adopting. Because many of the students we receive at Usul and many other sacred institutions of sacred learning, they come with certain a frame of mind, certain worldview that needs to be kind of fundamentally altered and changed so that things can make sense in a different light. You mentioned Ibn Sina. I mean, Ibn Sina belonged to a worldview and a world that's completely alien to most of us, where reality still consisted of sign. Reality was somehow semiotic text to be deciphered and read. Things pointed, things gestured, things meant something. Divine names were traces that were found everywhere. They could be perceived and studied, not just metaphorically, but these are realities that they're talking about. How much of our reality has become impoverished to us? How much of it has been reduced to just, we look at the sun and we just see nothing but a ball of helium or hydrogen burning in space, as opposed to something that's telling us something, right? A gesture, a meaning, etc., a sign. So we're going to go to Q&A right now, but just before we do that, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Mujaddad, for a wonderful talk and dialogue. And I feel like this kind of synergy between us, inshallah, works. And I feed off your ideas and you feed off my own. We want to keep this session short and crisp, inshallah. So we're going to go right now to about 15 minutes of Q&A. If anyone wants to ask any question, please do put it in the chat box, or raise your hand and say, I want to direct this question to Dr. Mujaddad, or to myself, or to anyone on the panel, inshallah. So start raising your hand, inshallah, or post the questions in the chat box, inshallah. Okay, let me see. Okay, Bismillah, we have a question from Hamza. Bismillah, do you want to go?
Assalamu alaikum. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Rahmatullah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I had two questions, actually. One was in relation to publication and its role in knowledge. So it seems like, depending on the field that you're referring to, of course, that there is this kind of publish or perish culture in modern universities. And so I'm curious to get either of your thoughts on how necessary that is. Should knowledge be pursued for the sake of knowledge, or should there be some practical application or use for that knowledge? It seems like there's papers that get published and they just kind of go into this void and are not really ever used. So just kind of thoughts on that. And then the second one was, given that modern institutions are so, like we're seeing right now with Gaza, complicit in so many of, the ills of the world, from arms manufacturers and just capitalism in general, is it a necessary evil for people to go to these universities? Should we be thinking about alternative forms of education that still allows us to have this secular and sacred knowledge, but then also be able to make a livelihood? And how should we be thinking about that going forward, maybe for the next generation? Jazakallah.
Mujaddad, do you want to take a stab at any of those?
Yeah, perhaps just the first one, in terms of the publish or perish. I think the modern university, because of its kind of technocratic structure, only recognizes in increasing ways the kind of a neoliberal hegemonic mentality that production is equal to some kind of prosperity. You have this prosperity theology. We're living in a prosperity pedagogy, modern university, where the more you're able to produce like a machine, often what is not spoken about is you don't really have anything to say. Should you be producing? That's the kind of the big question. And in previous times, that would have been absolutely fine. Unfortunately, we live in a moment where even the idea of the publication and the perish question comes out because of the increasing competition, because the modern universities are doing something very different, even different to 30 years ago. They are increasingly competing with one another, and the metric for competition is such. I think one way to kind of alleviate the stress on the individual, and this is also a fascinating element of it, never have we seen more people leaving the academy because of these pressures, because of mental health issues, because of pressures of competition. But the bigger question is, and I think that's where the sacredness partly comes into it, is what is the goodness of these things? Is it really any good? There's so many interesting articles being produced now, is related to social science as well as the sciences. Does production actually increase the great general stock of knowledge? And increasingly, that's not the case. If you look at the Royal Society of Philosophy, they produced a good number of articles about this in the last couple of years, in terms of music theory, in terms of philosophical investigations, and whether the production is actually leading to anything important. It's important for the individual because it's related to tenure and other such things. But the only advice in this manner would be related to do what's honest, and what has sincerity will last. And that's I think what the Islamic tradition has always been akin to, is sincerity is its own goodness. And this kind of really interesting puddle of messiness related to publications and the pressures on students and the pressures on testing, it doesn't have a long life in that respect, I don't think. But Dr. Samir, please.
No, I'll finish with the share, but in 2019, I left academia for that very reason, Hamza. Publish or perish. I decided I didn't want to publish or perish. I wanted to go a different way, and alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is where I think maybe the right kind of intention, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may open up other possibilities. And I've been pouring a lot of my energy into an alternative institution like Usul and others. Before it was the CMC, but now it's Usul. And helping those institutions and pouring a lot of my energy into that, where I don't have to publish or perish, but if I have something of value, research for the greater good of the ummah or for the greater good of knowledge itself, but whose objectives are quite clear, then I'll publish something. Otherwise, I don't have to churn out something endlessly for the purpose. To answer your second question very quickly, I think there's an abundance of these institutions right now, such that one can freely choose each institution that meets one's own ethical, moral standards. A lot of universities are complicit in so many different unethical. It's because they've lost their moral compass. Many of them are run as companies or corporations that need to maximize their profit, and they invest in arms and all sorts of different things. So here, I think we have an abundance of choice, and choose one that meets our standards as Muslims, inshallah. I want to go to a few questions in the chat box. The first one is, I have a daughter at university. We've tried this additive approach by sending her to various programs and intensives. How specifically should we supplement college and high school students' careers with Islam? It's a very, very important question, because I've confronted the same issue with a lot of people. I don't think it's enough to just say, I want to send my daughter to university, and then almost in a parallel universe, give her deen education somewhere. What has to happen is those inculcating traditional knowledge have to be sufficiently grounded in the classical Islamic tradition, but at the same time sufficiently aware of the limitations of the secular paradigm to allow this to engage with this in a way where this begins to make sense of this, and where the sacred knowledge and its principles can then be brought to bear on secular knowledge, and help integrate in the student of knowledge precisely how the secular knowledge is limited, how it fits, where it fits, what its intrinsic value is. If you just send someone to university here, and then on the weekend you send them to religious studies, they're not going to be able to figure out how these two worlds are related. So this integration, or this greater synthesis, or this ta'sil, tajdeed and ta'sil of Islamic thinking, those teaching this body of knowledge have to be sufficiently aware of what's going on in the modern academic context and understand the epistemological, ontological, philosophical problems that lie there. Otherwise, you're going to have someone who's kind of split down the middle. On the one hand, part of their brain operates within a secular paradigm, and then on the weekend, they operate within in a kind of an Islamic one, and they don't really see how they both fit together. Dr. Mujaddad, there's a question for you in the chat box. If you can read it, are you able to access the chat box, or should I read it for you?
Yes.
What are the primary factors contributing to the decline of curiosity among students? And how can universities address these challenges to reignite and sustain a passion for learning?
Well, that's a question for universities. I can't speak on their behalf. But in terms of, we know from kind of statistical studies and the field of higher education in educational studies shows that students are generally learning less, paying more, and spending more time at universities for diminished returns. If you look at a great book on this, which kind of set off this whole trend, was Academically Adrift, a really brilliant book about empirical studies about what students are learning and what is retained and what is necessary. That even when students are getting, you know, a first or 4.0 or 3.8 GPAs, they're leaving dissatisfied because the way that the university examinations are set up, it's a very specific kind of energy is required. And so you can, you know, ace your exams, you can do all these wonderful things, but you essentially are delimited in because your potential is not connected with. And that's something which, you know, people like Cardinal Newman was speaking about in the 19th century when he was talking about the development of the first Catholic university in Dublin, is that the pursuit of truth as opposed to credentials is what gives life to all of these things. And we live in a society, in a modern world, in which the kind of means ends is what counts, as well as perhaps in a previous time that wasn't the case. It's the journey is as much as important as the ends, and that's part of what ihsan is. Just coming, I saw a question in the chat about Islamic pedagogy and teacher training. I think this is an incredibly important time for that, is to revive, to begin to open those pages of traditional Islamic learning, because you have, for example, wonderful medieval texts which really have no Western equivalent when it comes to teacher training, for example. And the great tragedy, I think, of this whole discussion is that there is an underlying assumption that Islam really didn't add anything to educational thought, maybe practice in institutions like the madrasa. But in terms of the thought, there is really nothing, which is a great tragedy. So if you look at, I would recommend someone like Zarnuji or the Tazkirat of Ibn Jama'ah, speaking about the adab of the teacher when before going into the class, the rules of sitting with your students, the rules of the student with the teacher. Why this is important.
Sorry, Sophia, you accidentally muted Mujaddad. Can you unmute him, please?
Sorry. I think I'm being, that's a subtle hint to stop speaking. But I think that's really, I mean, if you're in teacher training, if you're a parent or a homeschooler, you know, those pages are beginning to be opened and made accessible to people. And that is what I think is the immediate task of learning, is that there is an incredible paradigm. We know more about the Prophet ﷺ than any other person in pre-modern history. And so much of the Sunnah relates to the manner of learning. Our entire tradition, the story of Adam begins with a pedagogic moment. And I've never seen in any other organized religion that to be the case. That it begins with a pedagogic inscription into the very story of what it means to be a human being. Allama Adam, that Allah taught Adam the names. He could have created Adam with the names inherent within his soul, but there's something about that. And in relationship to that, the Mufassirun said, why was Adam a student? He was a student before he was a prophet, a master. It's because to learning the adab of being a student before you become a prophet and a teacher. So these subtleties in our tradition are there. It's, I think, at this point in time and this work that the Usul Academy are doing, there's colleagues around myself and others are doing. Inshallah, God willing, it will bear fruit and for the greater good of these needs in the community.
Inshallah. I'm going to end on a note, but while I'm doing that, Dr. Mujaddad, if you want, you can continue responding in the chat box. I think some people have requested a few texts or names that you mentioned, but I'm going to end it on I think what is a very important note based on what Dr. Mujaddad just mentioned, which is the fundamental relationship between adab and akhlaq on the one hand and knowledge on the other. It's something you don't find in a modern secular academy. You never find a professor of physics telling you, go be compassionate so you can understand more of reality. But in the Islamic tradition, the more virtuous you are as a human being, the more layers or horizons of reality open up before you, and the more you can know of those. And so the virtue and ethics has an epistemic horizon. And it opens up ontological aspects of reality. And so you have to be more virtuous to be more of the human being you can be. In the Ishraqi language, you become more intense form of light, or you possess more of wujud, and the more of wujud you possess, the more intense your being becomes by virtuous practice. The more you are, and the more you are, the more you know of reality. And so this is extremely important, right? And you find this emphasized again and again in the Islamic tradition, the relationship between virtue, ethics on the one hand, and your capacity to know more and more of reality. So physics and ethics are not separate. They're intertwined. The very fabric of reality is intertwined with what we are and what we can become. That's why tahqiq, the realization of the insan al-kamil, who ascends rung after rung upon the ladder of realization, is what allows one to then know more and more of reality. It's like saying, by climbing up higher and higher a mountain, the more the view I have, the more expansive the view I have of reality. Right? That's one way of looking at it, inshallah. We're going to leave it at that, inshallah. This is just a first talk in a series of talks on education, on the future of the university, and on what we, at least at Usul Academy, see ourselves doing and assisting with for the Ummah by addressing the needs of many students who are at secular universities. Many of our shuyukh and academics are grounded in the classical Islamic tradition, but simultaneously deeply literate or deeply steeped in the contemporary secular disciplines, whether the social sciences or the sciences. And not only that, but are able to then bring to bear on the secular academy many of the ta'sili Islamic principles and perspectives that are much needed today, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you at our next talk, inshallah. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you, Dr. Mujaddad, once again.